Back in 2008, a citizen of Zimbabwe could walk into a market with a $100 trillion bill in their pocket, and they still wouldn't have enough money to buy, like, a single loaf of bread.
Which is just, it's incredibly hard to even wrap your head around.
Right. I mean, their wallet was essentially catching fire from the loss of purchasing power before they could even open it. And, when you hear a wild statistic like that, it feels totally disconnected from your own life.
Oh, absolutely.
You just want to pay rent, get a decent meal, maybe buy a slightly larger TV than your cousin has. But that terrifying hyperinflation scenario and, your desire for a bigger TV, they're actually driven by the exact same invisible machinery.
Yeah, it's this massive machinery that most of us never see.
Yeah.
Mostly because it's usually buried under just a huge mountain of academic jargon.
Yeah.
But that is exactly why you're here with us today. You have this drive to truly understand the mechanics of how the world operates, and you want to do it without slogging through some dense 500-page textbook.
Exactly. Which brings us to our source material for today's deep dive. We're looking at this incredibly dense, rapid-fire transcript from a video that attempts to explain literally all of economics in just 20 minutes.
It's a sprint, a brilliant, chaotic sprint.
It really is. But our mission today is to hit the brakes. We're going to slow that pace all the way down and extract the fundamental gears of the global economy.
Right. We want to trace how a simple human desire scales up into these massive, fragile, and honestly, often wildly irrational global systems.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we strip away the stock markets and the shipping containers, where does the entire concept of economics actually begin?
Well, it begins with an undeniable kind of sobering physical reality, which is scarcity. To understand anything about the economy, you first have to accept that as humans, our wants are virtually unlimited, right?
Right, we want everything.
Exactly. But we live on a rock floating in space with a strictly limited amount of stuff. There's only so much arable land, so much fresh water, and so much human time.
So if we lived in some magical universe where you could just snap your fingers and summon infinite pizza, economics wouldn't exist.
It literally wouldn't. The entire field would just vanish. Economics is not fundamentally about money. I mean, it's the study of how we make choices in a world where there just isn't enough to go around.
Ah, okay. Because if everything is infinite, we never actually have to make a choice.
That's the core of it. And because of scarcity, every single decision you make forces you into an opportunity cost. Doing one thing means you are actively choosing not to do something else.
So, the fact that you, the listener, are spending time on this deep dive right now, it means you're giving up 20 minutes you could have spent watching, I don't know, cat fails on the internet.
Exactly. Your time is scarce, so listening to us is your opportunity cost.
Yeah.
And this unavoidable reality of scarcity and opportunity cost, that's what forces human beings to trade.
Okay, that makes sense. If I have 10 apples and you have 5 bananas, we swap.
Right, it benefits both of us. But here is where the source material introduces a concept called comparative advantage. And it's completely counterintuitive.
Wait, yeah, I definitely want to push back on this a bit, because the source claims that even if you are literally worse at doing everything than everyone else on the planet, you can still be economically useful in a trade.
I know, it sounds crazy.
How does that actually make sense? If I'm the absolute worst worker in the room, how am I winning a trade?
It sounds like a total paradox, but it's really the secret engine of human cooperation. Trade isn't about being the absolute best at a task. It's about being the least worst at the right thing, proportionally speaking.
Okay, I'm going to need an example for that.
Fair enough. Let's use a stark example. Imagine I'm a world-renowned brain surgeon, right? And through some weird quirk of fate, I am also the fastest data entry typist in the world. I'm better at surgery than you, and I'm better at typing than you.
I am feeling deeply inadequate in this scenario, but go on.
Well, even though I'm faster at typing, my opportunity cost for doing it is catastrophic. Every hour I spend typing numbers into a spreadsheet is an hour day. I am not performing a highly paid, life-saving surgery.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
My time is just too valuable to spend on data entry. Your opportunity cost for typing, however, is much lower. So if you specialize in the data entry and I pay you to do it, we both end up wealthier.
Oh, right. I might be slower than you, but I'm proportionally more efficient because of what I'm not giving up.
Exactly. Specializing in trading based on comparative advantage is just a mathematical win-win.
That reframes things completely. So if we take scarcity, the necessity of choice, and comparative advantage, we basically have the recipe for a market.
We do.
But a market needs a communication system, right? If millions of people are specializing in trading, they can't all just shout at each other to figure out what things are worth.
Right, they need a signaling mechanism. And that mechanism is prices, which are driven by incentives.
Mhm.
A market is essentially this endless tug of war.
Like, if a basic cheese pizza is priced at $100, that number acts as a massive disincentive for buyers.
Precisely. But if the piece is $1, buyers are incredibly incentivized to buy 10 of them. Meanwhile, the seller is heavily disincentivized to keep the oven on because, well, they're losing money on every single pie.
So they keep adjusting until they hit the equilibrium price, the exact dollar amount where the number of pizzas the seller wants to bake perfectly matches the number of pizzas the buyers want to eat.
Exactly. But to actually execute that transaction, barter is incredibly clunky.
Yeah, if I'm a freelance graphic designer and I want a coffee, I can't just offer to design a logo for the barista every single morning. That gets weird fast.
Which is exactly why societies invent money. The source material refers to money as the ultimate economic lubricant.
I love that phrase.
It's very accurate. It solves the awkward barter problem by acting as a medium of exchange, a universally recognized unit of account, and a store of value. You trade your logo design for a standardized placeholder dollars, and then trade that placeholder for coffee.
And once you have money lubricating the gears, these local markets scale up into massive supply chains. The source uses a $14 avocado toast to illustrate this, and I think it's just a brilliant way to visualize
I
it.
hope it's a great example.
A single piece of avocado toast is essentially this global Rube Goldberg machine for breakfast. Just think about the sequence. It starts with land, the physical soil in Mexico for the avocados, the fields in Kansas for the wheat.
Right.
Then you layer on labor, the farmers planting, the drivers navigating supply routes, the cafe worker assembling it, and finally you inject capital, the heavy machinery, the irrigation systems, the $6,000 espresso machine sitting on the cafe counter.
Yeah, the coordination is astonishing.
Yeah.
And when you combine land, labor, and capital, you generate what economists call productivity.
And productivity is the big one, right?
It is the ultimate dividing line between a wealthy society and a poor one. It measures how efficiently a country turns those inputs into outputs. High productivity means your tools and your workers are so efficient that you generate more toast, more cars, more software per hour of human effort.
Whereas low productivity means people are working just as hard or even harder, but they're using blunt tools and waiting hours just to produce a single meal.
Exactly.
So if productivity is the engine creating all this value, governments obviously need a way to track it. We need a scoreboard to know if the Rube Goldberg machine is actually making the country wealthier or just spinning its wheels.
And that's why we created a metric called gross domestic product, or GDP. It basically represents the total monetary value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific year.
The word final is the critical mechanic there, right?
Absolutely. You count the $14 avocado toast, but you do not count the wholesale avocado or the flour used to bake the bread. If you counted the ingredients and the final product, you'd be artificially double counting the economy's size.
But looking at the source's breakdown of GDP, it seems like a remarkably flawed scoreboard. I mean, it completely ignores unpaid labor.
Oh, entirely.
If a parent stays home to raise their children, creating immense value for society, GDP registers that as zero. On the flip side, if a factory turns out toxic chemicals and the government has to spend billions cleaning up the environmental disaster, GDP goes up because of the cleanup spending.
Yeah, the source captures this perfectly with an analogy.
Mm.
GDP is like a microwave with no door.
That's such a funny image.
It is. It's fundamentally flawed, it leaks radiation, but it's still the most useful tool we have for tracking the business cycle. It tells us if we're in a period of booming expansion or a painful recession.
And it helps central banks monitor that dangerous balance between aggregate demand, how much stuff people want to buy, and aggregate supply, how much stuff the economy can actually produce.
Because when that balance breaks, you summon inflation.
Which brings us right back to that terrifying Zimbabwe example from 2008. The source notes, they hit an annual inflation rate of 89.76 trillion percent. That is an 897 followed by 20 zeros. How does a country's math break that spectacularly?
It happens when the mechanism of money is fundamentally abused. Inflation, at its core, is just too much money chasing too few goods. In Zimbabwe's case, the government was facing massive debts and a collapsing agricultural sector.
So the actual supply of goods was shrinking.
Exactly. And to pay their bills, the government simply printed more and more physical cash. But printing a $1 trillion bill doesn't magically print $1 trillion worth of wheat.
Right, so if everyone suddenly has a wheelbarrow full of cash, but there are only 5 loaves of bread left in the entire market, the seller simply raises the price of the bread to absorb the new cash.
And the money itself becomes completely worthless. It destroys trust in the currency overnight.
Which highlights a truly terrifying reality. If manipulating the money supply can literally incinerate a society's wealth, whoever controls those levers holds godlike power over the economy.
In modern economies, those levers are controlled by central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the US or the European Central Bank. And their primary tool isn't actually printing physical cash.
It's manipulating interest rates, right?
Mm,
Which is essentially setting the price of borrowing money. Let's slow down and look at the actual mechanics of that. How does changing the interest rate physically alter the economy?
Think of the interest rate as a throttle. If inflation's getting too high, meaning the economy's running too hot, the central bank raises interest rates.
Okay.
Suddenly, it becomes much more expensive for a business to take out a loan to build a new factory or for a family to get a mortgage. Because borrowing is expensive, businesses stop expanding, they hire fewer people, consumers spend less.
And companies are forced to lower prices to attract whatever demand is left, so the inflation cools down.
Exactly. Conversely, if the economy is in a recession, the central bank lowers rates, making money cheap to borrow, which incentivizes spending and hiring.
But the source material points out something about modern banking that genuinely sounds like a scam the first time you hear it.
Fractional reserve banking.
Yes. When a bank gives you a loan, they aren't actually handing you money that someone else deposited. They are quite literally typing new money into existence.
Yep. It's wild to think about. When you deposit $1,000 into a commercial bank, the bank is only required by law to keep a small fraction of that, say $100 in reserve.
And they take the other 900 and lend it out to someone buying a car.
Right. That $900 gets deposited into the car dealer's bank account, and that bank lends out a fraction of it again.
So the money supply multiplies through this cascade of digital ledgers. The money in my savings account isn't sitting in a vault, it's a theoretical promise.
And it works flawlessly until everyone panics and demands their physical cash at the exact same moment.
A bank run.
Exactly. So central banks manage the money supply, but governments are the entities actually spending it on the ground to build society.
And governments fund that spending primarily through taxation, right? They extract value from the economy, taking a slice of your income, taxing your property, or applying excise taxes to things like alcohol and tobacco.
And they use those funds to provide public goods that the free market just wouldn't naturally build on its own.
Things like the national highway system, public schools, or as the source Riley notes, $80 million military experimental jets that occasionally crash during test flights.
Yeah, that happens. But governments almost always spend more than they extract in taxes. This creates a deficit, which they cover by borrowing money, usually by issuing government bonds.
Which brings us to a number that causes a lot of anxiety: the national debt. Looking at the data from the source, the scale is just staggering. The U.S. has over $34 trillion in national debt. Japan's debt is equivalent to 260% of their entire GDP.
Those are massive numbers.
When I look at my own personal credit card statement, debt is inherently a bad thing. Is government debt simply a ticking time bomb?
It's entirely natural to compare a government budget to a household budget. But mechanically, they operate very differently. Government debt is not inherently toxic. In fact, it's often a really powerful tool for growth, provided it's used for productive investment.
So like building infrastructure.
Exactly. If a government borrows $1 billion at a low interest rate to build a massive new port facility, that port makes shipping cheaper, businesses become more profitable, and the overall economy grows. The economic growth generated by the port outpaces the interest accumulating on the debt. It essentially pays for itself.
Oh, I see. So it's the difference between taking out a student loan to become a high-earning software engineer versus taking out a high-interest personal loan to buy a sports car you definitely can't afford.
That is the perfect distinction. Sovereign debt only spirals into a crisis when it is squandered. The source refers to this as funding vote nonsense, short-term political handouts or inefficient subsidies that do not increase the country's long-term productivity.
And if a government accumulates massive debt without growing the economy, global investors eventually lose trust.
Right, and they demand higher and higher interest rates to compensate for the risk.
And then you hit a death spiral where the government has to borrow money just to pay the interest on the money they already borrowed, We saw that exact catastrophic default play out in Greece in 2012 and in Argentina multiple times.
It's a brutal reminder that a country's internal economic engine requires constant maintenance.
Mhm.
But of course, no country operates in a vacuum.
Because no single nation has the natural resources, the labor force, and the capital to produce everything its citizens want. So what happens when these massive individual national engines have to interlock?
We get international trade, which takes the concept of comparative advantage and scales it up to a planetary level.
Right.
Brazil has the perfect climate for growing coffee, while Japan has highly specialized capital for manufacturing robotics. So instead of Japan wasting billions trying to grow coffee in greenhouses, they export robots and import Brazilian coffee.
It drives massive global efficiency. But because they operate on entirely different currencies, this necessitates the foreign exchange market, or Forex. Because if a Japanese robotics company sells machines in the US, they're paid in dollars, but they need yen to pay their factory workers in Tokyo.
So they have to trade the money itself.
Yeah.
Exchange rates fluctuate constantly based on a dizzying array of factors. You've got inflation rates, geopolitical stability, interest rate changes, and sometimes just the unpredictable mood of global investors.
This web of global trade is what we call globalization. And the source makes it clear that while it drastically lowers the price of goods, it also masks a terrifying amount of fragility.
Very fragile.
The 2021 Suez Canal disaster is the ultimate case study. One single container ship lost steering and got wedged diagonally across a canal. That single boat froze roughly 12% of all global trade.
Just one boat.
It caused a traffic jam of 400 ships and cost the global economy an estimated $10 billion every single day it was stuck.
It exposes the hidden danger of hyper-efficiency. The global supply chain has stripped away all the buffer room to keep prices low. We witnessed the same systemic shock during the 2020 semiconductor shortage.
Oh, yeah.
A few specialized factories in East Asia went offline, and suddenly auto manufacturers in Detroit and Germany had to halt production. We reached a bizarre reality where used cars were selling for more than brand new ones, simply because you couldn't finish building the new ones without those chips.
The global economy is a miracle of logistics, but it is built on glass. And, up until this point, we have been talking about this system as if it's purely a math equation. We're discussing factories, ledgers, shipping routes.
Right.
But the foundational layer of every single economic model is human beings. And human beings are incredibly messy.
Which forces us to look at labor and finance. The labor market operates in the exact same supply and demand curves, but the product being sold is human time, and the price is a wage.
But it's heavily influenced by power dynamics. Consider the wage gap the source highlights. In the 1960s, a CEO made roughly 20 times what the average worker made. Today, that ratio is closer to 350 times.
And the source is quick to point out that CEOs didn't suddenly evolve to work 350 times harder than a factory worker.
Right. That massive divergence is driven by complex stock option compensation, corporate market consolidation, and the fact that modern workers generally have vastly weaker collective bargaining power than they did during the peak of unionization.
Yeah. And once people do earn that capital, they deploy it into financial markets. They buy stocks, which represent fractional ownership in a company, or bonds, which are loans. But then the financial sector invents tools that detach from physical reality entirely, like derivatives.
I always hear that word, but let's break down how a derivative actually functions.
At its simplest, a derivative is just a contract that derives its value from the performance of an underlying asset. Imagine an airline company. Their biggest risk is the fluctuating price of jet fuel. To protect themselves, they buy a derivative contract that pays out if fuel prices spike. It is essentially an insurance policy, a highly effective way to hedge risk. But the danger arises when financial institutions start buying and selling millions of these derivative contracts based on other contracts.
Essentially placing bets on bets.
Exactly. And when the underlying asset fails, the entire house of cards collapses, which is largely what triggered the 2008 financial crisis.
And the modern evolution of that speculative betting is cryptocurrency, which the source hilariously refers to as math-powered casino chips.
It's a great description.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Every single traditional economic model, from supply and demand to complex derivatives, relies on one fundamental assumption: that humans are rational actors who will always make calculating, optimal choices to maximize their wealth.
And as the field of behavioral economics points out, anyone who has ever met an actual human being knows that is demonstrably false.
Yeah, The source calls us chaos merchants, which might be the most accurate description of humanity ever written. We are deeply, systematically irrational, and the source provides some amazing examples of the specific cognitive biases that break economic models.
Take the concept of hyperbolic discounting. If I offer you $5 right now, or $50 a year from now, traditional math says you should take the 50.
Obviously.
But human brains are terrible at valuing the future, so a huge percentage of people will take the $5 today simply because the reward is immediate.
Or the concept of anchoring. Like if a tech company announces a new headset and starts the presentation by suggesting it could cost $10,000 and then finally reveals the real price is $3,000, suddenly that astronomical price feels like a massive bargain.
Yep. They anchored your brain to a higher number to manipulate your perception of value.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most common trap is the sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, I do this all the time.
We all do. How many times have you willingly sat through an agonizingly terrible movie sequel, fully knowing it's bad, simply because you already invested 10 hours watching the previous films in the franchise?
Too many times. Rationally, you should just turn it off and reclaim your time. But human nature hates acknowledging wasted investment.
This built-in irrationality is exactly why purely free markets sometimes fail to produce good outcomes for individuals. It's why governments and corporations have learned to use nudges.
Like auto-enrolling you in a 401k.
Exactly. If you leave it entirely up to rational choice, millions of people simply won't save for retirement because the future feels too far away. So companies change the architecture of the choice. They make the responsible choice the default, knowing that if you had to actively opt in, your chaotic human brain would probably just spend that money on immediate gratification.
It is a profound realization. When we look at the macro systems detailed in the source capitalism leaning on free markets or socialism and communism leaning on state control, we realize they are all just different frameworks trying to answer three fundamental questions. What do we produce? How do we produce it? And who gets to consume it?
And because of human complexity, no pure system exists. Almost every modern nation is a mixed economy, constantly tweaking the dials between the invisible hand of the market and the stabilizing intervention of the government.
Let's summarize the immense ground we've covered today. We started with the absolute bedrock of scarcity, the unyielding reality that our resources are limited. We explored how opportunity cost forces us to trade, which necessitated the invention of money and gave rise to the breathtaking complexity of global supply chains. We broke down the mechanics of how central banks throttle the economy with interest rates, how governments balance productive debt, and how hyperinflation can destroy a society's trust overnight. We saw the fragile efficiency of globalization and finally arrived at the chaotic, deeply biased human psychology that underpins the entire structure.
It is an intricate, constantly evolving machine.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over today. The entire architecture of everything we just discussed is built on one single premise: scarcity. But right now, we are watching the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence and robotics.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
What happens if, in the distant future, AI and automation drive the cost of labor and production down to essentially zero? If we ever reach a post-scarcity world, a world where energy is virtually free and we finally have the equivalent of infinite pizza, does the global economy as we know it simply cease to exist? If the fundamental problem of scarcity disappears, what exactly takes its place?
That is the ultimate economic question for the next century.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.